Chapter 16 of TESS of the D'URBERVILLES by Thomas Hardy. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. TESS of the D'URBERVILLES by Thomas Hardy. Read by Adrian Praetzellis. Phase the Third. The Rally. Chapter 16. On a time-scented, bird-hatching morning in May, between 2 and 3 years after the return from Trantridge, silent, reconstructive years for Tess Durbeyfield, she left her home for the second time. Having packed up her luggage so that it could be sent to her later, she started in a hired trap for the little town of Stour Castle, through which it was necessary to pass on her journey, now in a direction almost opposite to that of her first adventuring. On the curve of the nearest hill she looked back regretfully at Marlott and her father's house, although she had been so anxious to get away. Her kindred dwelling there would probably continue their daily lives as heretofore, with no great diminution of pleasure in their consciousness, although she would be far off, and they deprived of her smile. In a few days the children would engage in their games as merrily as ever, without the sense of any gap left by her departure. This leaving of the younger children she had decided to be for the best. Were she to remain, they would probably gain less good by her precepts than harm by her example. She went through Stour Castle without pausing, and onward to a junction of highways, where she could await a carrier's van that ran to the south-west, for the railways which engirdled this interior tract of country had never yet struck across it. While waiting, however, there came along a farmer in his spring cart, driving approximately in the direction that she wished to pursue. Although he was a stranger to her, she accepted his offer of a seat beside him, ignoring that its motive was a mere tribute to her countenance. He was going to Weatherbury, and accompanying him thither she could walk the remainder of the distance instead of travelling in the van by way of Casterbridge. Tess did not stop at Weatherbury after this long drive, further than to make a slight nondescript meal at noon at a cottage to which the farmer recommended her. Thence she started on foot, basket in hand, to reach the wide upland of heath dividing this district from the low-lying meads of a further valley in which the dairy stood that was the aim and end of her day's pilgrimage. Tess had never before visited this part of the country, and yet she felt akin to the landscape. Not so very far to the left of her she could discern a dark patch in the scenery, which inquiry confirmed her in supposing to be trees marking the environments of Kingsbere, in the church of which parish the bones of her ancestors, her useless ancestors, lay entombed. She had no admiration for them now. She almost hated them for the dance they had led her. Not a thing at all that had been theirs did she retain but the old seal and spoon. "Pooh! I have as much of mother as father in me," she said. "All my prettiness comes from her, and she was only a dairymaid." The journey over the intervening uplands and lowlands of Egdon, when she reached them, was a more troublesome walk than she had anticipated, the distance being actually but a few miles. It was 2 hours, owing to sundry wrong turnings, ere she found herself on a summit commanding the long-sought-for vale, the valley of the great dairies, the valley in which milk and butter grew to rankness, and were produced more profusely, if less delicately, than at her home, the verdant plain so well watered by the river Var or Froom. It was intrinsically different from the Vale of Little Dairies, Blackmoor Vale, which, save during her disastrous sojourn at Trantridge, she had exclusively known till now. The world was drawn to a larger pattern here. The enclosures numbered 50 acres instead of 10, the farmsteads were more extended, the groups of cattle formed tribes hereabout, there only families. These myriad of cows stretching under her eyes from the far east to the far west, outnumbered any she had ever seen at one glance before. The green lea was speckled as thickly with them as a canvas by Van Alsloot or Salart with burghers. The ripe hue of the red and dun kine absorbed the evening sunlight, which the white-coated animals returned to the eye in rays almost dazzling, even at the distant elevation on which she stood. The bird's-eye perspective before her was not so luxuriantly beautiful, perhaps, as that other one which she knew so well, yet it was more cheering. It lacked the intensively blue atmosphere of the rival vale, and its heavy soils and scents. The new air was clear, bracing, ethereal. The river itself, which nourished the grass and cows of these renowned dairies, flowed not like the streams in Blackmoor. Those were slow, silent, often turbid, flowing over beds of mud into which the incautious wader might sink and vanish unawares. The Froom waters were clear as the pure river of life shown to the evangelist, rapid as the shadow of a cloud, with pebbly shallows that prattled to the sky all day long. There the water-flower was the lily, the crowfoot here. Either the change in the quality of the air from heavy to light, or the sense of being amid new scenes where there were no invidious eyes upon her, sent up her spirits wonderfully. Her hopes mingled with the sunshine in an ideal protosphere which surrounded her as she bounded along against the soft south wind. She heard a pleasant voice in every breeze, and in every bird's note seemed to lurk a joy. Her face had latterly changed with changing states of mind, continually fluctuating between beauty and ordinariness, according as the thoughts were gay or grave. One day she was pink and flawless, another pale and tragical. When she was pink she was feeling less than when pale. Her more perfect beauty accorded with her less elevated mood, her more intense mood with her less perfect beauty. It was her best face physically that was now set against the south wind. The irresistible, universal, automatic tendency to find sweet pleasure somewhere, which pervades all life, from the meanest to the highest, had at length mastered Tess. Being even now only a young woman of 20, who mentally and sentimentally had not finished growing, it was impossible that any event should have left upon her an impression that was not in time capable of transmutation, and thus her spirit and her thankfulness and her hopes rose higher and higher. She tried several ballads, but found them inadequate, till, recollecting the psalter that her eyes had so often wandered over of a Sunday morning before she had eaten of the tree of knowledge, she chanted, "O ye sun and moon, O ye stars, ye green things upon the earth, ye fowls of the air, beasts and cattle, children of men, bless ye the Lord, praise him and magnify him for ever." She suddenly stopped and murmured, "Perhaps I don't quite know the Lord as yet." And probably the half-unconscious rhapsody was a fetishistic utterance in a monotheistic setting. Women whose chief companions are the forms and forces of outdoor nature retain in their souls far more of the pagan fantasy of their remote forefathers than of the systematized religion taught their race at a later date. However, Tess found at least approximate expression for her feelings in the old Benedicite that she had lisped from infancy, and it was enough. Such high contentment with such a slight initial performance as that of having started towards a means of independent living was a part of the D'Urberville temperament. Tess really wished to walk uprightly, while her father did nothing of the kind, but she resembled him in being content with immediate and small achievements, and in having no mind for laborious effort towards such petty social advancement as could alone be effected by a family so heavily handicapped as the once powerful D'Urbervilles were now. There was, it might be said, the energy of her mother's unexpended family. as well as the natural energy of Tess's years, rekindled after the experience which had so overwhelmed her for the time. Let the truth be told, women do as a rule live through such humiliations, and regain their spirits and again look about them with an interested eye. While there's life, there's hope, is a conviction not so entirely unknown to the betrayed as some amiable theorists would have us believe. Tess d'Urberville then, in good heart and full of zest for life, descended the Egdon slopes lower and lower toward the dairy of her pilgrimage. The marked difference in the final particular between the rival vales now showed itself. The secret of Blackmoor was best discovered from the heights around. To read aright the valley before her it was necessary to descend into its midst. When Tess had accomplished this feat, she found herself to be standing on a carpeted level which stretched to the east and west as far as the eye could reach. The river had stolen from the higher tracts and brought in particles to the vale all this horizontal land, and now, exhausted, aged and attenuated, lay serpentining along through the midst of its former spoils. Not quite sure of her direction, Tess stood still upon the hemmed expanse of verdant flatness, like a fly on a billiard table of indefinite length, and of no more consequence to the surroundings than that fly. The sole effect of her presence upon the placid valley, so far, had been to excite the mind of a solitary heron, which, after descending to the ground not far from her path, stood with neck erect, looking at her. Suddenly there arose from all parts of the lowland a prolonged and repeated call. "Wow! Wow! Wow!" From the furthest east to the furthest west the cries spread as if by contagion, accompanied in some cases by the barking of a dog. It was not the expression of the valley's consciousness that beautiful Tess had arrived, but the ordinary announcement of milking time, 4:30, when the dairyman set about gathering in the cows. The red and white herd nearest at hand, which had been phlegmatically waiting for the call, now trooped towards the steading in the background, their great bags of milk swinging under them as they walked. Tess followed slowly in their rear, and entered the barton by the open gate through which they had entered before her. Long thatched sheds stretched round the enclosure, their slopes encrusted with livid green moss, and their eaves supported by wooden posts rubbed to a glossy smoothness by the flanks of infinite cows and calves of bygone years, now passed to an oblivion almost inconceivable in its profundity. Between the posts were ranged the milchers, each exhibiting herself at the present moment to a whimsical eye in the rear as a circle on two stalks, down the centre of which a switch moved pendulum-wise, while the sun, lowering itself behind this patient row, threw their shadows accurately inward toward the wall. Thus it threw shadows of these obscure and homely figures every evening, with as much care over each contour as if it had been the profile of a court beauty on a palace wall, copied them as diligently as if it had copied Olympian shapes on marble facades long ago, or the outline of Alexander, Caesar, and the Pharaohs. They were the less restful cows that were stalled. Those that would stand still of their own will were milked in the middle of the yard, while many of such better behaved ones stood waiting now, all prime milchers, such as were seldom seen out of this valley, and not always within it, nourished by the succulent feed which the water meads supplied at this prime season of the year. Those of them that were spotted with white reflected the sunshine in dazzling brilliancy, and the polished brass knobs on their horns glittered with something of military display. Their large veined udders hung ponderous as sandbags, the teats sticking out like the legs of a gypsy's crock, and as each animal lingered for her turn to arrive, the milk oozed forth and fell in drops to the ground. End of chapter 16. 13 of Tess of the D'URBERVILLES. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Tess of the D'URBERVILLES by Thomas Hardy, read by Adrian Praetzellis. Chapter 17. The dairymaids and men had flocked down from their cottages and out of the dairy house with the arrival of the cows from the meads. The maids walking in pattens, not on account of the weather, but to keep their shoes above the mulch of the barton. Each girl sat down on her three-legged stool, her face sideways, her right cheek resting against the cow, and looked musingly along the animal's flank at Tess as she approached. The male milkers, with hat brims turned down, resting flat on their foreheads and gazing on the ground, did not observe her. One of these was a sturdy, middle-aged man, whose long white pinner was somewhat finer and cleaner than the wraps of the others, and whose jacket underneath had a presentable marketing aspect. The master dairyman of whom she was in quest, his double character as a working milker and butter maker here during 6 days, and on the 7th as a man in shining broadcloth in his family pew at church, being so marked as to have inspired a rhyme. Dairyman Dick all the week. On Sundays, Mr. Richard Crick. Seeing Tess standing at gaze, he went across to her. The majority of dairymen have a cross manner at milking time, but it happened that Mr. Crick was glad to get a new hand, for the days were busy ones now, and he received her warmly, inquiring for her mother and the rest of the family, though this as a matter of form merely, for in reality he had not been aware of Mrs. Durbeyfield's existence till apprised of the fact by a brief business letter about Tess. "Oh, as a lad I knowed your part of the country very well," he said terminatively, "though I've never been there since. And a aged woman of 90 that used to live nigh here, but is dead and long gone, told me that a family of some such name as yours in Blackmoor Vale came originally from these parts, and that 'twere an old ancient race that had all but perished off the earth, though the new generations didn't know it. But Lord, I took no notice of the old woman's ramblings, not I." "Oh no, it is nothing," said Tess. Then the talk was of business only. "You can milk 'em clean, my maidy? I don't want my cows going a zoo at this time of year." She reassured him on that point, and he surveyed her up and down. She had been staying indoors a good deal, and her complexion had grown delicate. "Quite sure you can stand it? 'Tis comfortable enough here for rough folk, but we don't live in a cowcumber frame." She declared that she could stand it, and her zest and willingness seemed to win him over. "Well, I suppose you'll want a dish of tea or victuals of some sort, hey? Not yet? Well, do as ye like about it. But faith, if 'twas I should be as dry as a kex we travelling so far." "I'll begin milking now to get my hand in," said Tess. She drank a little milk as temporary refreshment, to the surprise, indeed slight contempt, of Dairyman Crick, to whose mind it had apparently never occurred that milk was good as a beverage. "Oh, if ye can swallow that, be it so," he said indifferently, while a milker held up the pail that she sipped from. "'Tis what I hain't touched for years, not I. Rot the stuff! It would lie in my inwards like lead. You can try your hand upon she," he pursued, nodding to the nearest cow. "Not but what she do milk rather hard. We've hard ones and we've easy ones, like other folks. However, you'll find out that soon enough." When Tess had changed her bonnet for a hood, and was really on her stool under the cow, and the milk was squirting from her fists into the pail, she appeared to feel that she had really laid a new foundation for her future. The conviction bred serenity. Her pulse slowed, and she was able to look about her. The milkers formed quite a little battalion of men and maids, the men operating on the hard-teated animals, the maids on the kindlier natures. It was a large dairy. There were nearly 100 milchers under Crick's management all told, and of the herd the master dairyman milked 6 or 8 with his own hands unless away from home. These were the cows that milked hardest of all, for his journey milkmen being more or less casually hired, he would not entrust this half-dozen to their treatment, lest, from indifference, they should not milk them fully, nor to the maids, lest they should fail in the same way for lack of finger grip, with the result that in course of time the cows would go azoo, that is, dry up. It was not the loss for the moment that made slack milking so serious, but that with the decline of the demand there came a decline and ultimately cessation of supply. After Tess had settled down to her cow there was for a time no talk in the barton, and not a sound inferred with the purr of the milk jets into the numerous pails, except a momentary exclamation to one or other of the beasts requesting her to turn round or stand still. The only movements were those of the milkers' hands up and down, and the swing of the cows' tails. Thus they all worked on, encompassed by the vast flat mead which extended to either slope of the valley, a level landscape compounded of old landscapes long forgotten, and no doubt differing in character very greatly from the landscape they composed now. "To my thinking," said the dairyman, rising suddenly from a cow he had just finished off, snatching up his 3-legged stool in one hand and the pail in the other, and moving on to the next hard yielder in his vicinity, "to my thinking, the cows don't gie down their milk to-day as usual. Upon my life, if Winkler do begin keeping back like this, she'll not be worth going under by midsummer." "'Tis because there's a new hand come among us," said Jonathan Kail. "I've noticed such things afore." "To be sure, it may be so. I didn't think on't." "I've been told that it goes up into their horns at such times," said a dairymaid. "Well, as to going up into their horns," replied Dairyman Crick dubiously, as though even witchcraft may be limited by anatomical possibilities, "I couldn't say. I certainly could not. But as nut cows will keep it back as well as the horned ones, I don't quite agree to it. Do ye know that riddle about the nut cows, Jonathan? Why do nut cows give less milk in a year than horned?" "I don't," interposed the milkmaid. "Why do they?" "Because there bain't so many of 'em," said the dairyman. "Howsomever, these gamesters do certainly keep back their milk to-day. Folks, we must lift up a stave or two. That's the only cure for't." Songs were often resorted to in dairies hereabout as an enticement to the cows when they showed signs of withholding their usual yield, and the band of milkers at this request burst into melody, in purely businesslike tones it is true, and with no great spontaneity, the result, according to their own belief, being a decided improvement during the song's continuance. When they had gone through 14 or 15 verses of a cheerful ballad about a murderer who was afraid to go to bed in the dark because he saw certain brimstone flames around him, one of the male milkers said, "I wish singing on the stoop didn't use up so much of a man's wind. You should get your harp, sir, not but what a fiddle is best." Tess, who had given an ear to this, thought the words were addressed to the dairyman, but she was wrong. A reply, in the shape of "Why?" came as it were out of the belly of a dun cow in the stalls. It had been spoken by a milker behind the animal, whom she had not hitherto perceived. "Oh yes, there's nothing like a fiddle," said the dairyman.
though I do think that bulls are more moved by a tune than cows, at least that's my experience. Once there was an old aged man over at Mellstock, William Dewey by name, one of the family that used to do a good deal of business as tranters over there. Jonathan, do you mind? I knowed the man by sight as well as I knowed my own brother, in a manner of speaking. Well, this man was a coming home along from a wedding where he had been playing his fiddle one fine moonlight night, and for shortness' sake he took a cut across 40 acres, a field lying that way, where a bull was out to grass. The bull seed William and took after him, horns aground begad, and though William runned his best, and hadn't much to drink in him, considering 'twas a wedding and the folks well off, he found he'd never reach the fence and get over in time to save himself. Well, as a last thought he pulled out his fiddle as he runned, and struck up a jig, turning to the bull and backing toward the corner. The bull softened down and stood up, looking hard at William Dewey, who fiddled on, till a sort of a smile stole over the bull's face. But no sooner did William stop his playing and turn to get over hedge than the bull would stop his smiling and lower his horns toward the seat of William's breeches. Well, William had to turn about and play on willy-nilly, and 'twas only 3 o'clock in the world, and I knowed that nobody would come that way for hours, and he so leery and tired that I didn't know what to do. When he had scraped till about 4 o'clock, he felt that he verily would have to give over soon, and he said to himself, "There's only this last tune between me and eternal welfare. Heaven save me, or I'm a done man." Well, then he called to mind how he'd seen cattle kneel o' Christmas Eves in the dead of night. It was not Christmas Eve then, but it came into his head to play a trick upon the bull. So he broke into the Tivity hymn, just as at Christmas carol singing, and lo and behold, down went the bull on his bended knees, in his ignorance, just as if 'twere true Tivity night and hour. As soon as his horned friend were down, William turned, clinked off like a long dog, and jumped safe over hedge before the praying bull had got to his feet again to take after him. William used to say that he'd seen a man look a fool a good many times, but he'd never seen such a fool as that bull looked when he found his pious feelings had been played upon, and 'twas not Christmas Eve. Yes, William Dewey, that was the man's name, and I can tell you to a foot where he's a-lying in Mellstock churchyard at this very moment, just between the second yew tree and the north aisle. It's a curious story. It takes us back to medieval times when faith was a living thing." The remark, singular for a dairy yard, was murmured by the voice behind the dun cow, but as nobody understood the reference, no notice was taken, except that the narrator seemed to think it might imply a scepticism as to his tale. "Well, 'tis quite true, sir, whether or no. I knowed the man well." "Oh yes, I have no doubt of it," said the person behind the dun cow. Tess's attention was thus attracted to the dairyman's interlocutor, of whom she could see but the merest patch, owing to his burying his head so persistently in the flank of the milcher. She could not understand why he should be addressed as "sir" even by the dairyman himself. But no explanation was discernible. He remained under the cow long enough to have milked 3, uttering a private ejaculation now and then, as if he could not get on. "Take it gentle, sir, take it gentle," said the dairyman. "'Tis knack, not strength, that does it." "So I find," said the other, standing up at last and stretching his arms. "I think I have finished her, however, though she made my fingers ache." Tess could then see him at full length. He wore the ordinary white pinner and leather leggings of a dairy farmer when milking, and his boots were clogged with the mulch of the yard. But this was all his local livery. Beneath it was something educated, reserved, subtle, sad, differing.
But the details of his aspect were temporarily thrust aside by the discovery that he was the one whom she had seen before. Such vicissitudes had Tess passed through since that time that for a moment she could not remember where she had met him, and then it flashed upon her that he was the pedestrian who had joined at the club dance at Marlott. The passing stranger who had come she knew not whence, had danced with others but not with her, had slightly left her and gone on his way with his friends. The flood of memories brought back by this revival of an incident anterior to her troubles produced a momentary dismay lest, recognizing her also, he should by some means discover her story. But it passed away when she found no sign of remembrance in him. She saw by degrees that since her first and only encounter his mobile face had grown more thoughtful, and had acquired a young man's shapely moustache and beard, the latter of the palest straw colour where it began upon his cheeks, and deepening to a warm brown further from its root. Under his linen milking pinner he wore a dark velveteen jacket, cord breeches and gaiters, and a starched white shirt. Without the milking gear nobody could have guessed what he was. He might with equal probability have been an eccentric landowner or a gentlemanly ploughman. That he was but a novice at dairy work she had realized in a moment, from the time he had spent upon the milking of one cow. Meanwhile many of the milkmaids had said to one another of the newcomer, "How pretty she is!" with something of real generosity and admiration, though with half a hope that the auditors would qualify the assertion, which, strictly speaking, they might have done, prettiness being an inexact definition of what struck the eye in Tess. When the milking was finished for the evening they straggled indoors, where Mrs Crick, the dairyman's wife, who was too respectable to go out milking herself, and wore a hot stuff gown in warm weather because the dairymaids wore prints, was giving an eye to the leads and things. Only 2 or 3 of the maids, Tess learned, slept in the dairy house besides herself, most of the helpers going to their homes. She saw nothing at supper time of the superior milker who had commented on the story, and asked no questions about him, the remainder of the evening being occupied in arranging her place in the bedchamber. It was a large room over the milk-house, some 30 feet long, the sleeping cots of the other 3 indoor milkmaids being in the same apartment. They were blooming young women, and, except one, rather older than herself. By bedtime Tess was thoroughly tired, and fell asleep immediately. But one of the girls who occupied an adjoining bed was more wakeful than Tess, and would insist upon relating to the latter various particulars of the homestead into which she had just entered. The girl's whispered words mingled with the shades, and to Tess's drowsy mind they seemed to be generated by the darkness in which they floated. "Mr Angel Clare, he that is learning milking, and that plays the harp, never says much to us. He is a parson's son, and is too much taken wi' his own thoughts to notice girls. He is the dairyman's pupil, learning farming in all its branches. He has learned sheep farming at another place, and he's now mastering dairy work. Yes, he is quite the gentleman born. His father is the Reverend Mr Clare at Emminster, a good many miles from here." "Oh, I have heard of him," said her companion, now awake. "A very earnest clergyman, is he not?" "Yes, that he is. The earnestest man in all Wessex, they say. The last of the Low Church sort, they tell me, for all about here be what they call high. All his sons, except our Mr Clare, be made parsons too." Tess had not at this hour the curiosity to ask why the present Mr Clare was not made a parson like his brethren, and gradually fell asleep again, the words of her informant coming to her along with the smell of the cheeses in the adjacent cheese loft, and the measured dripping of the whey from the rings downstairs. End of chapter 17. Of TESS of the D'URBERVILLES by Thomas Hardy. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. TESS of the D'URBERVILLES by Thomas Hardy. Read by Adrian Praetzellis. Chapter 18. Angel Clare rises out of the past not altogether as a distinct figure, but as an appreciative voice, a long regard of fixed, abstracted eyes, and a mobility of mouth somewhat too small and delicately lined for a man's, though with an unexpectedly firm close of the lower lip now and then, enough to do away with any inference of indecision. Nevertheless, something nebulous, preoccupied, vague in his bearing and regard marked him as one who had probably had no very definite aim or concern about his material future. Yet, as a lad, people had said of him that he was one who might do anything if he tried. He was the youngest son of his father, a poor parson at the other end of the county, and had arrived at Talbothays Dairy as a 6 months' pupil, after going the round of some other farms, his object being to acquire a practical skill in the various processes of farming, with a view either to the colonies or the tenure of a home farm, as circumstances might decide. His entry into the ranks of the agriculturalists and breeders was a step in the young man's career which had been anticipated neither by himself nor by others. Mr Clare the elder, whose first wife had died and left him a daughter, married a second late in life. This lady had somewhat unexpectedly brought him 3 sons, so that between Angel, the youngest, and his father the vicar there seemed to be almost a missing generation. Of these boys the aforesaid Angel, the child of his old age, was the only son who had not taken a university degree, though he was the single one of them whose early promise might have done full justice to an academical training. Some 2 or 3 years before Angel's appearance at the Marlott dance, on a day when he had left school and was pursuing his studies at home, a parcel came to the vicarage from the local booksellers, directed to the Reverend James Clare. The vicar, having opened it and found it to contain a book, read a few pages, whereupon he jumped up from his seat and went straight to the shop with the book under his arm. "Why has this been sent to my house?" he asked peremptorily, holding up the volume. "It was ordered, sir." "Not by me, nor any one belonging to me, I am happy to say." The shopkeeper looked in his order book. "Oh, it has been misdirected, sir," he said. "It was ordered by Mr Angel Clare, and should have been sent to him." Mr Clare winced as if he had been struck. He went home pale and dejected, and called Angel into his study. "Look into this book, my boy," he said. "What do you know about it?" "I ordered it," said Angel simply. "What for?" "To read." "How can you think of reading it?" "How can I? Why, it's a system of philosophy. There is no more moral or even religious work published." "Yes, moral enough, I don't deny that. But religious? For you, who intend to be a minister of the gospel?" "Since you have alluded to the fact, father," said the son, with anxious thought upon his face, "I should like to say, once for all, that I should prefer not to take orders. I fear I could not conscientiously do so. I love the Church as one loves a parent. I shall always have the warmest affection for her. There is no institution for whose history I have a deeper admiration. But I cannot honestly be ordained her minister, as my brothers are, while she refuses to liberate her mind from an untenable redemptive theolatry." It had never occurred to the straightforward and simple-minded vicar that one of his own flesh and blood could come to this. He was stultified, shocked, paralysed, and if Angel were not going to enter the church, what was the use of sending him to Cambridge? The university as a step to anything but ordination seemed, to this man of fixed ideas, a preface without a volume. He was a man not merely religious but devout, a firm believer, not as the phrase now exclusively construed by the theological thimble riggers in the church and out of it, but in the old and ardent sense of the evangelical school, one who could indeed opine that the eternal and divine did 18 centuries ago in very truth. Angel's father tried argument, persuasion, entreaty. "No, father, I cannot underwrite Article 4, leave alone the rest, taking it in the literal and grammatical sense as required by the Declaration, and therefore I can't be a parson in the present state of affairs," said Angel. "My whole instinct in matters of religion is towards reconstruction, to quote your favourite epistle to the Hebrews, the removing of those things that are shaken, as of things that are made, that those things which cannot be shaken may remain." His father grieved so deeply that it made Angel quite ill to see him. "What is the good of your mother and me economizing and stinting ourselves to give you a university education if it is not to be used for the honour and glory of God?" his father repeated. "Why, that it may be used for the honour and glory of man, father." Perhaps if Angel had persevered he might have gone to Cambridge like his brothers. But the vicar's view of that seat of learning as a stepping stone to orders alone was quite a family tradition. And so rooted was the idea in his mind that perseverance began to appear to the sensitive son akin to an intent to misappropriate a trust and wrong the pious heads of the household, who had been and were, as his father had hinted, compelled to exercise much thrift to carry out this uniform plan of education for the 3 young men. "I will do without Cambridge," said Angel at last. "I feel that I have no right to go there in the circumstances." The effects of this decisive debate were not long in showing themselves. He spent years and years in desultory studies, undertakings and meditations. He began to evince considerable indifference to social forms and observances. The material distinctions of rank and wealth he increasingly despised. Even the "good old family," to use a favourite phrase of a late local worthy, had no aroma for him unless there were new good resolutions in its representatives. As a balance to these austerities, when he went to live in London to see what the world was like, and with a view to practising a professional business there, he was carried off his head and nearly entrapped by a woman much older than himself, though luckily he escaped not greatly the worse for the experience. Early association with country solitudes had bred in him an unconquerable and almost unreasonable aversion to modern town life, and shut him out from such success as he might have aspired to by following a mundane calling in the impracticability of the spiritual one. But something had to be done. He had wasted many valuable years, and having an acquaintance who was starting on a thriving life as a colonial farmer, it occurred to Angel that this might be a lead in the right direction. Farming, either in the colonies, America, or at home, farming at any rate, after becoming well qualified for the business by a careful apprenticeship, that was a vocation which would probably afford an independence without the sacrifice of what he valued even more than a competency, intellectual liberty. So we find Angel Clare at 26 here at Talbothays as a student of kine, and as there were no houses at hand in which he could get a comfortable lodging, a boarder at the dairyman's. His room was an immense attic which ran the whole length of the dairy house. It could only be reached by a ladder from the cheese loft, and had been closed up for a long time till he arrived and selected it as his retreat. Here Clare had plenty of space, and could often be heard by the dairy folk pacing up and down when the household had gone to rest. A portion was divided off at one end by a curtain, behind which was his bed, the outer part being furnished as a homely sitting-room. At first he lived up above entirely, reading a good deal, and strumming upon an old harp which he had bought at a sale, saying when in a bitter humour that he might have to get his living by it in the streets some day. But he soon preferred to read human nature by taking his meals downstairs in the general dining kitchen, with the dairyman and his wife, and the maids and men, who altogether formed a lively assembly, for though but few milking hands slept in the house, several joined the family at meals. The longer Clare resided here, the less objection had he to his company, and the more did he like to share quarters with them in common. Much to his surprise, he took indeed a real delight in their companionship. The conventional farm folk of his imagination, personified by the pitiable dummy known as Hodge, were obliterated after a few days' residence. At close quarters no Hodge was to be seen. At first, it is true, when Clare's intelligence was fresh from a contrasting society, these friends with whom he now hobnobbed seemed a little strange. Sitting down as a level member of the dairyman's household seemed at the outset an undignified proceeding. The ideas, the modes, the surroundings appeared retrogressive and unmeaning. But with living on there day after day, the acute sojourner became conscious of a new aspect in the spectacle. Without any objective change whatever, variety had taken the place of monotonousness. His host and his host's household, his men and his maids, as they became intimately known to Clare, began to differentiate themselves as in a chemical process. The thought of Pascal's was brought home to him. On trouve qu'il y a plus d'hommes originaux. Les gens du commun ne trouvent pas de différence entre les hommes. The typical and unvarying Hodge ceased to exist. He had been disintegrated into a number of varied fellow creatures, beings of many minds, beings infinite in difference, some happy, many serene, a few depressed, one here and one there bright even to genius, some stupid, others wanton, others austere, some mutely Miltonic, some poetically Cromwellian, into men who had private views of each other as he had of his friends, who could applaud or condemn each other, amuse or sadden themselves by the contemplation of each other's foibles or vices, men every one of whom walked in his own individual way the road to dusty death. Unexpectedly he began to like the outdoor life for its own sake, and for what it brought, apart from its bearing on his own proposed career. Considering his position, he had become wonderfully free from the chronic melancholy which is taking hold of the civilized races with the decline of belief in a beneficent power. For the first time of late years he could read as his musings inclined him, without any eye to cramming for a profession, since the few farming handbooks which he deemed it desirable to master occupied him but little time. He grew away from old associations, and saw something new in life and humanity. Secondarily, he made close acquaintance with a phenomena which he had known before but darkly: the seasons in their moods, morning and evening, night and noon, winds in their different tempers, trees, waters, and mists, shade and silence, and the voices of inanimate things. The early mornings were still sufficiently cool to render a fire acceptable in the large room wherein they breakfasted, and by Mrs Crick's orders, who held that he was too genteel to mess at their table, it was Angel Clare's custom to sit in the yawning chimney-corner during his meal, his cup and saucer and plate being placed on a hinged flap at his elbow. The light from the long, wide, mullioned window opposite shone in upon this nook, and assisted by a secondary light of cold blue quality which shone down the chimney, enabled him to read there easily whenever disposed to do so. Between Clare and the window was the table at which his companions sat, their munching profiles rising sharply against the panes, while to the side was the milk-house door, through which were visible the rectangular leads in rows, full to the brim with the morning's milk. At the further end the great churn could be seen revolving, and its slip-slopping heard, the moving power being discernible through the window in the form of a spiritless horse, walking in a circle and driven by a boy. For several days after Tess's arrival, Clare, sitting abstractly reading from some book, periodical, or piece of music just come by post, hardly noticed that she was present at table. She talked so little, and the other maids talked so much, that the babble did not strike him as possessing a new note, and he was ever in the habit of neglecting the particulars of an outward scene for the general impression. One day, however, when he had been conning one of his music scores, and by force of imagination was hearing the tune in his head, he lapsed into listlessness, and the music sheet rolled to the hearth. He looked at the fire of logs, with its one flame pirouetting at the top of a dying dance after the breakfast cooking and boiling, and it seemed to jig to his inward tune; also at the two chimney crooks dangling down from the cotterel or crossbar, plumed with soot, which quivered to the same melody; also at the half-empty kettle whining an accompaniment. The conversation at the table mixed in with his phantasmal orchestra, till he thought, "What a fluty voice one of those milkmaids has! I suppose it is the new one." Clare looked round upon her, seated with the others. She was not looking towards him. Indeed, owing to his long silence, his presence in the room was almost forgotten. "I don't know about ghosts," she was saying, "but I do know that our souls can be made to go outside our bodies when we are alive." The dairyman turned to her with his mouth full, his eyes charged with serious inquiry, and his great knife and fork—breakfasts were breakfasts here—planted erect on the table, like the beginning of a gallows. "What, really now? And is it so, maidy?" he said. "A very easy way to feel them go," continued Tess, "is to lie on the grass at night and look straight up at some big bright star, and by fixing your mind upon it you will soon find that you are hundreds and hundreds of miles away from your body, which you don't seem to want at all." The dairyman removed his hard gaze from Tess and fixed it on his wife. "Now that's a rum thing, Christiana, eh? To think o' the miles I've vamped the starlit nights these last 30 years, courting or trading or for doctor or for nurse, and never had the least notion of that till now, or filled my soul rise as much as an inch above my shirt collar." The general attention being drawn to her, including that of the dairyman's pupil, Tess flushed, and remarking evasively that it was only a fancy, resumed her breakfast. Clare continued to observe her. She soon finished her eating, and, having a consciousness that Clare was regarding her, began to trace imaginary patterns on the tablecloth with her forefinger, with the constraint of a domestic animal that perceives itself to be watched. "What a fresh and virginal daughter of nature that milkmaid is!" he said to himself. And then he seemed to discern in her something that was familiar, something which carried him back into a joyous and unforeseeing past, before the necessity of taking thought had made the heavens grey. He concluded that he had beheld her before. Where, he could not tell. A casual encounter during some country ramble it certainly had been, and he was not greatly curious about it; but the circumstance was sufficient to lead him to select Tess in preference to the other pretty milkmaids when he wished to contemplate contiguous womankind. Chapter 18 Of TESS of the D'URBERVILLES by Thomas Hardy. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. TESS of the D'URBERVILLES by Thomas Hardy. Read by Adrian Praetzellis. Chapter 19. In general, the cows were milked as they presented themselves, without fancy or choice. But certain cows will show a fondness for a particular pair of hands, sometimes carrying this predilection so far as to refuse to stand at all except to their favourite, the pail of a stranger being unceremoniously kicked over. It was Dairyman Crick's rule to insist on breaking down these partialities and aversions by constant interchange, since otherwise, in the event of a milkman or maid going away from the dairy, he was placed in a difficulty. The maid's private aims, however, were the reverse of the dairyman's rule. The daily selection by each damsel of the 8 or 10 cows to which she had grown accustomed, rendering the operation on their willing udders surprisingly easy and effortless. Tess, like her compeers, soon discovered which of the cows had a preference for her style of manipulation, and her fingers having become delicate from the long domiciliary imprisonments to which she had subjected herself at intervals during the last 2 or 3 years, she would have been glad to meet the milcher's views in this respect. Out of the whole 95 there were 8 in particular: Dumpling, Fancy, Lofty, Mist, Old Pretty, Young Pretty, Tidy and Loud, who, though the teats of 1 or 2 were as hard as carrots, gave down to her with a readiness that made her work on them a mere touch of the fingers. Knowing, however, the dairyman's wish, she endeavoured conscientiously to take the animals just as they came, excepting the very hard yielders, which she could not yet manage. But she soon found a curious correspondence between the ostensibly chance position of the cows and her wishes in this matter, till she felt that their order could not be the result of accident. The dairyman's pupil had lent a hand in getting some of the cows together of late, and at the 5th or 6th time she turned her eyes, as she rested against the cow, full of sly inquiry upon him. "Mr. Clare, you have ranged the cows," she said, blushing, and in making the accusation symptoms of a smile gently lifted her upper lip in spite of her, so as to show the tips of her teeth, the lower lip remaining severely still. "Well, it makes no difference," said he. "You will always be here to milk them." "Do you think so? I hope I shall, but I don't know." She was angry with herself afterwards, thinking that he, unaware of her grave reasons for liking this seclusion, might have mistaken her meaning. She had spoken so earnestly to him, as if his presence were somehow a factor in her wish. Her misgiving was such that at dawn, when the milking was over, she walked in the garden alone to continue her regrets that she had disclosed to him her discovery of his considerateness. It was a typical summer evening in June, the atmosphere being in such delicate equilibrium and so transmissive that inanimate objects seemed endowed with 2 or 3 senses, if not 5. There was no distinction between the near and the far, and an auditor felt close to everything within the horizon. The soundlessness impressed her as a positive entity rather than as the mere negation of noise. It was broken by the strumming of strings. Tess had heard those notes in the attic above her head. Dim, flattened, constrained by their confinement, they had never appealed to her as now, when they wandered in the still air with a stark quality like that of nudity. To speak absolutely, both instrument and execution were poor, but the relative is all, and as she listened, Tess, like a fascinated bird, could not leave the spot. Far from leaving, she drew up towards the performer, keeping behind the hedge that he might not guess her presence. The outskirt of the garden in which Tess found herself had been left uncultivated for some years, and was now damp and rank with juicy grass which sent up mists of pollen at a touch, and with tall blooming weeds emitting offensive smells, weeds whose red and yellow and purple hues formed a polychrome as dazzling as that of cultivated flowers. She went stealthily as a cat through this profusion of growth, gathering cuckoo spittle on her skirts, cracking snails that were underfoot, staining her hands with thistle milk and slug slime, and rubbing off upon her naked arms sticky blights which, though snow white on the apple tree trunks, made madder stains on her skin. Thus she drew quite near to Clare, still unobserved of him. Tess was conscious of neither time nor space. The exaltation which she had described as being productible at will by gazing at a star came now without any determination of hers. She undulated upon the thin notes of the second-hand harp, and their harmonies passed like breezes through her, bringing tears into her eyes. The floating pollen seemed to be his notes made visible, and the dampness of the garden the weeping of the garden's sensibility. Though near nightfall, the rank-smelling weed-flowers glowed as if they would not close for intentness, and the waves of colour mixed with the waves of sound. The light, which still shone, was derived mainly from a large hole in the western bank of cloud. It was like a piece of day left behind by accident, dusk having closed in elsewhere. He concluded his plaintive melody, a very simple performance, demanding no great skill, and she waited, thinking another might be begun. But, tired of playing, he had desultorily come round the fence, and was rambling up behind her. Tess, her cheeks on fire, moved away furtively, as if hardly moving at all. Angel, however, saw her light summer gown, and he spoke, his low tones reaching her, though he was some distance off. "What makes you draw off in that way, Tess?" said he. "Are you afraid?" "Oh no, sir, not of outdoor things, especially just now when the apple blooth is falling, and everything so green." "But you have your indoor fears, eh?" "Well, yes, sir." "What of?" "I couldn't quite say." "The milk turning sour?" "No." "Life in general?" "Yes, sir." "Ah, so have I, very often. This hobble of being alive is rather serious, don't you think so?" "It is, now you put it that way." "All the same, I shouldn't have expected a young girl like you to see it so just yet. How is it you do?" She maintained a hesitating silence. "Come, Tess, tell me in confidence." She thought that he meant what were the aspects of things to her, and replied shyly, "The trees have inquisitive eyes, haven't they? That is, seems as if they had. And the river says, 'Why do ye trouble me with your looks?' And you seem to see numbers of tomorrows, just all in a line, the first of them the biggest and clearest, the others getting smaller and smaller as they stand further away. But they all seem very fierce and cruel, and as if they said, 'I am coming, beware of me, beware of me.' And you, sir, can raise up dreams with your music, and drive all such horrid fancies away." He was surprised to find this young woman, who, though but a milkmaid, had just that touch of rarity about her which might make her the envied of her housemates, shaping such sad imagings. She was expressing in her own native phrases, assisted a little by her sixth standard training, feelings which might almost have been called those of the age, the ache of modernism. The perception arrested him less when he reflected that what are called advanced ideas are really in great part but the latest fashion in definition. A more accurate expression, by words in logy and ism, of sensations which men and women have vaguely grasped for centuries. Still, it was strange that they should have come to her while yet so young. More than strange, it was impressive, interesting, pathetic. Not getting the cause, there was nothing to remind him that experience is as to intensity and not as to duration. Tess's passing corporeal blight had been her mental harvest. Tess, on her part, could not understand why a man of clerical family and good education, and above physical want, should look upon it as a mishap to be alive. For the unhappy pilgrim herself there was very good reason. But how could this admirable and poetic man ever have descended into the valley of humiliation, have felt with the man of Uz, as she had herself felt 2 or 3 years ago, "My soul chooseth strangling and death rather than my life. I loathe it. I would not live alway." It was true that he was at present out of his class, but she knew that was only because, like Peter the Great in a shipwright's yard, he was studying what he wanted to know. He did not milk cows because he was obliged to milk cows, but because he was learning how to be a rich and prosperous dairyman, landowner, agriculturalist, and breeder of cattle. He would become an American or Australian Abraham, commanding like a monarch his flocks and his herds, his spotted and ring-straked, his manservants and his maids. At times, nevertheless, it did seem unaccountable to her that a decidedly bookish, musical, thinking young man should have chosen deliberately to be a farmer and not a clergyman, like his father and brothers. Thus, neither having the clue to the other's secret, they were respectively puzzled at what each revealed, and awaited new knowledge of each other's character and moods without attempting to pry into each other's history. Every day, every hour, brought to him one more little stroke of her nature, and to her one more of his. Tess was trying to lead a repressed life, but she little divined the strength of her own vitality. At first Tess seemed to regard Angel Clare as an intelligence rather than as a man. As such she compared him to herself, and at every discovery of the abundance of his illuminations, of the distance between her own modest mental standpoint and the unmeasurable Andean altitude of his, she became quite dejected, disheartened from all further effort on her own part whatever. He observed her dejection one day when he had casually mentioned something to her about pastoral life in ancient Greece. She was gathering the buds called lords and ladies from the bank while he spoke. "Why do you look so woebegone all of a sudden?" he asked. "Oh, 'tis only about my own self," she said, with a frail laugh of sadness, fitfully beginning to peel a lady meanwhile. "Just a sense of what might have been with me. My life looks as if it had been wasted for want of chances. When I see what you know, what you have read and seen and thought, I feel what a nothing I am. I'm like the poor Queen of Sheba who lived in the Bible. There is no more spirit in me." "Bless my soul, don't go troubling about that." "Why," he said with some enthusiasm, "I should be only too glad, my dear Tess, to help you to anything in the way of history, or any line of reading you would like to take up." "It is a lady again," interrupted she, holding out the bud she had peeled. "What?" "I mean that there are always more ladies than lords when you come to peel them." "Never mind about the lords and ladies. Would you like to take up any course of study? History, for example?" "Sometimes I feel I don't want to know anything more about it than I know already." "Why not?" "Because what's the use of learning that I am one of a long row only, finding out that there is set down in some old book some one just like me, and to know that I shall only act her part,
making me sad, that's all. The best is not to remember that your nature and your past doings have been just like thousands and thousands, and that your coming life and doings 'll be like thousands and thousands." "What? Really then, you don't want to learn anything?" "I shouldn't mind learning why the sun do shine on the just and the unjust alike," she answered, with a slight quaver in her voice. "But that's what books will not tell me." "Tess, fie for such bitterness!" Of course he spoke with a conversational sense of duty only, for that sort of wandering had not been unknown to himself in bygone days. And as he looked at the unpractised mouth and lips, he thought that such a daughter of the soil could only have caught up the sentiment by rote. She went on peeling the lords and ladies till Clare, regarding for a moment the wave-like curl of her lashes as they drooped with her bent gaze on her soft cheek, lingeringly went away. When he was gone she stood a while, thoughtfully peeling the last bud, and then, awakening from her reverie, flung it and all the crowd of florid nobility impatiently on the ground, in an ebullition of displeasure with herself for her niaiseries, and with a quickening warmth in her heart of hearts. How stupid he must think her! In an access of hunger for his good opinion she bethought herself of what she had latterly endeavoured to forget, so unpleasant had been its issues, the identity of her family with that of the knightly d'Urbervilles. Barren attribute as it was, disastrous as its discovery had been in many ways to her, perhaps Mr Clare, as a gentleman and a student of history, would respect her sufficiently to forget her childish conduct with the lords and ladies, if he knew that those Purbeck marble and alabaster people in Kingsmere Church really represented her own lineal forefathers, that she was no spurious d'Urberville, compounded of money and ambition like those at Trantridge, but true d'Urberville to the bone. But before venturing to make the revelation, dubious Tess indirectly sounded the dairyman as to its possible effect upon Mr Clare, by asking the former if Mr Clare had any great respect for old county families when they had lost all their money and land. "Mr Clare," said the dairyman emphatically, "is one of the most rebellest rozzums you ever knowed. Not a bit like the rest of his family, and if there's one thing that he do hate more than another, 'tis the notion of what's called a old family. He says that it stands to reason that old families have done their spurt of work in past days, and can't have anything left in 'em now. There's the Billets and the Drenkards and the Greys and the St Quentins and the Hardys and the Goulds, who used to own the lands for miles down this valley. You could buy 'em all up now for a song a'most. Why, our little Retty Priddle here, you know, is one of the Paradells, the old family that used to own lots of the land out by King's Hittock, now owned by the Earl of Wessex, afore even he or his was heard of. Well, Mr Clare found this out, and spoke quite scornful to the poor girl for days. 'Ah,' he says to her, 'you'll never make a good dairymaid. All your skill was used up ages ago in Palestine, and you must lie fallow for 1,000 years to get strength for more deeds.' A boy came here t'other day asking for a job, and said his name was Matt, and when we asked him his surname, he said he'd never heard that I had any surname, and when we asked why, he said he supposed his folks hadn't been stablished long enough. 'Ah, you're the very boy I want,' said Mr Clare, jumping up and shaking hands with en. 'I've great hopes of you,' and gave him £half-a-crown. Oh no, he can't stomach old families." After hearing this caricature of Clare's opinions, poor Tess was glad that she had not said a word in a weak moment about her family.
even though it was so unusually old as almost to have gone round the circle and become a new one. Besides, another dairy girl was as good as she, it seemed, in that respect. She held her tongue about the d'Urberville vault and the night of the Conqueror whose name she bore. The insight afforded into Clare's character suggested to her that it was largely owing to her supposed untraditional newness that she had won interest in his eyes. End of chapter 19. Of TESS of the D'URBERVILLES by Thomas Hardy. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. TESS of the D'URBERVILLES by Thomas Hardy, read by Adrian Praetzellis. Chapter 20. The season developed and matured. Another year's instalment of flowers, leaves, nightingales, thrushes, finches, and such ephemeral creatures took up their positions where only a year ago others had stood in their place, when these were nothing more than germs and inorganic particles. Rays from the sunrise drew forth the buds and stretched them into long stalks, lifted up sap in noiseless streams, opened petals, and sucked out secrets in invisible jets and breathings. Dairyman Crick's household of maids and men lived on comfortably, placidly, even merrily. Their position was perhaps the happiest of all positions in the social scale, being above the line at which neediness ends, and below the line at which the conveniences begin to cramp natural feeling, and the stress of threadbare modishness makes too little of enough. Thus passed the leafy time, when arborescence seems to be the only thing aimed at out of doors. Tess and Clare unconsciously studied each other, ever balanced on the edge of a passion, yet apparently keeping out of it. All the while they were converging under an irresistible law, as surely as two streams in one vale. Tess had never in her recent life been so happy as she was now, possibly never would be so happy again. She was, for one thing, physically and mentally suited among these new surroundings. The sapling, which had rooted down to a poisonous stratum on the spot of its sowing, had been transplanted to a deeper soil. Moreover, she, and Clare also, stood as yet on the debatable land between predilection and love, where no profundities have been reached, no reflections have set in, awkwardly inquiring, whither does this new current tend to carry me? What does it mean to my future? How does it stand towards my past? Tess was the merest stray phenomenon to Angel Clare as yet, a rosy, warming apparition which had only just acquired the attribute of persistence in his consciousness. So he allowed his mind to be occupied with her, deeming his preoccupation to be no more than a philosopher's regard of an exceeding novel, fresh, and interesting specimen of womankind. They met continually. They could not help it. They met daily in that strange and solemn interval, the twilight of the morning, in the violet or pink dawn, for it was necessary to rise early, so very early, here. Milking was done betimes, and before the milking came the skimming, which began at a little past 3. It usually fell to the lot of some one or other of them to wake the rest, the first being aroused by an alarm clock, and, as Tess was the latest arrival, and they soon discovered that she could be depended upon not to sleep through the alarm as the others did, this task was thrust most frequently upon her. No sooner had the hour of 3 struck and whizzed than she left her room and ran to the dairyman's door, then up the ladder to Angel's, calling him in a loud whisper, then woke her fellow dairymaids. By the time that Tess was dressed, Clare was downstairs and out in the humid air. The remaining maids and the dairyman usually gave themselves another turn on the pillow, and did not appear until a quarter of an hour later. The grey half-tones of daybreak are not the grey half-tones of the day's close, though the degree of their shade may be the same. In the twilight of the morning, light seems active, darkness passive. In the twilight of evening, it is the darkness which is active and crescent, and the light which is the drowsy reverse. Being so often, possibly not always by chance, the first two persons to get up at the dairy house, they seemed to themselves the first persons up of all the world. In these early days of her residence here, Tess did not skim, but went out of doors at once after rising, where he was generally awaiting her. The spectral, half-compounded, aqueous light which pervaded the open mead impressed them with a feeling of isolation, as if they were Adam and Eve. At this dim, inceptive stage of the day, Tess seemed to Clare to exhibit a dignified largeness, both of disposition and physique, an almost regnant power, possibly because he knew that at that preternatural time hardly any woman so well endowed in person as she was likely to be walking in the open air within the boundaries of his horizon. Very few in all England. Fair women are usually asleep at midsummer dawns. She was close at hand, and the rest were nowhere. The mixed, singular, luminous gloom in which they walked along together to the spot where the cows lay often made him think of the resurrection hour. He little thought that the Magdalene might be at his side. Whilst all the landscape was in neutral shade, his companion's face, which was the focus of his eyes, rising above the mist stratum, seemed to have a sort of phosphorescence about it. She looked ghostly, as if she were merely a soul at large. In reality, her face, without appearing to do so, had caught the cold gleam of day from the north-east. His own face, though he did not think of it, wore the same aspect to her. It was then, as has been said, that she impressed him most deeply. She was no longer the milkmaid, but a visionary essence of woman, a whole sex condensed into one typical form. He called her Artemis Demeter, and other fanciful names half-teasingly, which she did not like because she did not understand them. "Call me Tess," she would say askance, and he did. Then it would grow lighter, and her features would become simply feminine. They had changed from those of a divinity who could confer bliss to those of a being who craved it. At these non-human hours they could get quite close to the waterfowl. Herons came with a great bold noise as of opening doors and shutters out of the boughs of a plantation which they frequented at the side of the mead, or, if already on the spot, hardily maintained their standing in the water, as the pair walked by, watched them by moving their heads round in a slow, horizontal, passionless wheel, like the turn of puppets by clockwork. They could then see the faint summer fogs in layers, woolly, level, and apparently no thicker than counterpanes, spread about the meadows in detached remnants of small extent. On the grey moisture of the grass were marks where the cows had lain through the night, dark green islands of dry herbage the size of their carcasses in a general sea of dew. From each island proceeded a serpentine trail by which the cow had rambled away to feed after getting up, at the end of which they found her, the snoring puff from her nostrils when she recognized them, making an intenser little fog of her own amid the prevailing one. Then they drove the animals back to the barton, or sat down to milk them on the spot, as the case might require. Or perhaps the summer fog was more general, and their meadows lay like a white sea, out of which the scattered trees rose like dangerous rocks. Birds would soar through it into the upper radiance, and hang on the wing sunning themselves, or alight on the wet rails subdividing the mead, which now shone like glass rods. Minute diamonds of moisture from the mist hung, too, upon Tess's eyelashes, and drops upon her hair like seed pearls. When the day grew quite strong and commonplace, these dried off her. Moreover, Tess then lost her strange and ethereal beauty. Her teeth, lips and eyes scintillated in the sunbeams, and she was again the dazzlingly fair dairymaid only, who had to hold her own against the other women of the world. About this time they would hear Dairyman Crick's voice, lecturing the non-resident milkers for arriving late, and speaking sharply to old Deborah Fyander for not washing her hands. "For heaven's sake, pop thy hands under the pump, Deb. Upon my soul, if the London folk only knowed of thee and thy slovenly ways, they'd swallow their milk and butter more mincingly than they do already, and that's saying a good deal." The milking proceeded, till towards the end Tess and Clare, in common with the rest, could hear the heavy breakfast table dragged out from the wall in the kitchen by Mrs Crick, this being the invariable preliminary to each meal, the same horrible scrape accompanying its return journey when the table had been cleared. End of chapter 20.